welcome to Pep Talks with Jeannie. I'm your host, Jeannie Pepper. I started doing Pep Talks as a way to inspire you to do intentional acts of kindness and to further the goals of #BlazeItForward. Since its inception, Pep Talks has evolved, and now I use it to interview people actively making a difference in this world through their volunteerism, community service, or careers. My guests are all here because they have dedicated their lives to making this world a better place. Join us as we delve into the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of these truly inspiring and hardworking people. This season, we will be using a panel format in some of our episodes to bring together synergistic guests to discuss topics that weave the social fabric of the world around us. Welcome to another episode of Pep Talks with Jeannie. My guest today is Sarah Moore with GLAAD. I'm going to let Sarah tell us about GLAAD, what GLAAD stands for, and what they do. Take it away.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, my name is Sarah Moore. I'm the Senior Manager of News and Research with GLAAD. We're the world's largest media advocacy organization for LGBTQ rights and people, and our main goal is accelerating acceptance for the LGBTQ community.
Oh, that's so fabulous. And how did you end up in this tremendously important position with GLAAD?
I have been working in the extremism and counterterrorism space for about 6 years now. I started out with a couple of other organizations that were tracking both international terrorism as well as domestic extremism. And through that work, found this unique opening with GLAAD that was looking at anti-LGBTQ hate and extremism in particular. And as somebody who identifies as bisexual and part of the LGBTQ community, it was really important to me to be able to work alongside all of the amazing people at GLAAD and help represent my community in this way.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your educational history. Did you know when you started school that you wanted to be part of this activism?
I wasn't sure when I started school. I actually thought I was going to be a forensic psychologist back in the day. And so I started as a psych major at University in Ohio. But since then, I have found a lot of different research projects that have touched on these areas around kind of the sociology and psychology of extremism and terrorism, and also the political ways that those particular terms have been used throughout time. And that's always just been a really fascinating area of research for me. So started out at some undergraduate projects that were focusing on this topic, and then made my way out to DC to focus on this full time.
Wow. Tell us what you know about extremism now. Is it worse now than it was when my son was murdered? Same? Like, what's happening in the United States now?
I think that's a really big question, right? There are so many different ways that we can define extremism and talk about extremism. At the particular moment in time in which your son was murdered, there was a big movement around these sort of accelerationist groups, including Atomwaffen division, which was, as you know, was one of the groups that were leading the radicalization of individuals that were going to go out and do these really horrific acts. We have seen since then not as much mobilization around kind of the accelerationist side, but more so right now, at least from my perspective, working on anti-LGBTQ hate, we're seeing a lot more mobilization on the sort of political and legal advocacy side. So we're seeing a lot more groups that are working hand in hand with politicians, working with other policymakers, working through city councils and through their school boards to push anti-LGBTQ policies in schools and libraries at the state and local levels. And so it's a different form of extremism, right? You're not going to see as much of the violent attacks that might have been more prevalent back when your son experienced what he went through. But we are seeing, this hate nonetheless manifesting through some of these more kind of legitimate, in quotes, means.
So it's almost insidious now and difficult to try to prevent it, stop it. I don't even know how you stop a school board meeting. I mean, because we've had the same problems here in Orange County with people hijacking city council meetings in the city I live in, Irvine, turned into opportunities for anti-Semitic individuals to scream and yell for hours. And the city council would listen to that. And I don't know why they put up with it, since it had nothing to do with city business. Is there anything that, like, do you get called in to deal with some of these issues with cities? in city council meetings, or is there any one kind of a meeting that you might interfere in, or do you just have to let them run their course?
Unfortunately, a lot of the activism that we're seeing on that side, like what you're talking about with the sort of Zoom bombing or public comments at city council meetings, it's a lot of those times those particular incidents are being counted as an act of free speech. So they are protected in that way. There's not anything that you can really do from a legal law enforcement side to prevent against those particular things. We have seen city councils take a couple of different steps that to try to avoid this. It might be that they avoid holding hybrid meetings, so everybody has to come in person. It could be that they require speakers to have a physical address in the county to prevent folks coming in from outside and making these kinds of hateful comments. It could be like you're talking about having restrictions on what topics are allowed to be discussed during the public comment portion. So there are different ways that these city councils are attempting to address this issue, but it is really tricky, right? Because obviously we don't want to infringe on people's free speech. You have a right to say what you want to say, even if it is something that's hateful. One of the things that I think is particularly unique about my work is that I track both criminal and non-criminal incidents of hate so that we are able to see the effects of incidents like this, which are protected under the First Amendment, but which are still hateful and are therefore a non-criminal incident of hate. That's something that I'm able to track that would be different than, let's say, what the FBI's hate crime statistics would show, because they are only going to be tracking things that are prosecuted officially as hate crimes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, when we talk about hate crimes and hate crimes against Jewish people, hate crimes against LGBTQ people, um, tell us about that intersection. And is that a very dangerous place to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the example of your son is a really poignant example of the ways that these kinds of hate can manifest. We do see in certain cases that there are people who are targeted for having these intersectional identities. For example, we know that Black trans women are one of the primary victims of anti-trans violence in the US. We know that, as in the case of your son, people that hold identities like being both Jewish and being gay can make somebody a bigger target for somebody who's part of a neo-Nazi organization. It might be seen as, being worth double in whatever kind of screwed up point system they have going on in their head. We're seeing, that when folks hold that those intersecting ideas or in those intersecting identities, that it unfortunately can make them more often targets of this kind of hateful rhetoric and hateful acts.
Yeah, is there anything that we can do to make this less of a problem for young people or for LGBTQ people? What can we do?
Yeah. I mean, I think, not allowing this kind of idea of intersecting identities to be considered a downfall or to be considered something that's dangerous is super important. I think that that's actually people's superpower, right? Myself being a bisexual woman, I know that I can enter certain spaces and talk to certain groups in a way that somebody who was a man in this role or somebody who was straight in this role might not be able to do. People who, like your son, we're both gay and Jewish, are going to be able to operate in spaces differently than folks who don't hold those particular identities. I think that that really is our ability to be able to enact these different conversations that are going to be what is able to drive change in the long term. I think with the results of the election and the change that we're going to see coming up politically, it's more important now than ever that we're finding those commonalities between different groups and folks that might have different ideas on different topics, and be able to build bridges on what we do share and be able to build coalition around that.
Yeah. From what you've seen, is there more danger in being LGBTQ or being Jewish?
That's a really tough question. I mean, we do know that unfortunately anti-Semitic incidents have been massively on the rise, especially after the horrific attacks in Israel last October. And so we do know that, there are a lot of people who unfortunately are being targeted over their Jewish identity right now in the US. At the same time, there are a lot of people who are LGBTQ who are also being targeted by this, right? And it might be happening in different ways. I think we're seeing a lot of the conversations around anti-Semitism focus on college campuses right now, which is historically a place where a lot of LGBTQ students have felt very safe, but they might be feeling unsafe in places like in their state legislatures where they're debating bans on gender affirming care, or at their local libraries where people are trying to enact book bans on LGBTQ related topics. So there are, as I mentioned before, there's different spaces and ways that people are going to be able to operate, and other spaces where they might not feel as safe. And that's where we can build this community and coalition and call out hate where we see it in spaces where we are maybe more protected.
Yeah, where are some of the places that you're most concerned right now for LGBTQ people?
I think LGBTQ people, we do have a number of safe spaces historically. That might be your local LGBTQ nonprofit. It could be a local LGBTQ nightclub. It could be, as I mentioned, college campuses or a GSA at a local school. And unfortunately, there's kind of a double-edged sword to that sort of visibility, because when those places are known for being safe spaces for LGBTQ people, they can, in some cases, attract extremist attention. And that's when we've started to see, especially in the past 2 years, folks going out and vandalizing the pride flags at some of these buildings. They might go out and send hateful flyers to these places. They might protest them, especially as we're seeing at schools that are trying to enact policies that are protective of LGBTQ students. And so, it can be that when we have these safe spaces and these kind of meeting points for LGBTQ people, that they are at the same time attracting this attention. So that's really where we're working with LGBTQ communities across the country and figuring out kind of better safety plans and procedures for protecting those who are trying to gather there and find community.
Yeah. If I'm a parent of an LGBTQ student in a middle school or high school right now, and my child is suffering from any form of discrimination, is that something GLAAD wants to know about?
Yes. So I helped launch with GLAAD the Alert Desk, which is our anti-LGBTQ extremism reporting tracker. We do have a report an incident form available on GLAAD's website. And if students are experiencing discrimination at the school level, they are welcome to report it through that form. I will say, unfortunately, we're not able to assist in resolving a number of these incidents right now. So that is something that, if it's a dangerous situation, you might want to consider bringing in law enforcement. You might want to consider bringing in school administrators. And you might want to consider legal options too, if it's a case of discrimination through the school district level.
Yeah. And what are the rules about this? I remember when my kids were in school and we were having issues with freedom of religion issues. And it started up right away when Blaze, my first child, started public school, and we were treated very disrespectfully during the holiday season, the first holiday season. Um, I did not feel that we were respected, and that the teacher used the parents to teach religion in the school, because there's this gray area where if a parent is coming in to help a child do a show and tell, that they can talk about anything they want to. What's to stop a parent with an agenda, an LGBTQ agenda, from coming in and helping a child to say things that are discriminatory or terrible about the LGBTQ community during a show and tell?
Sure. I think that's really where we see the importance of local school boards in helping to regulate against those kinds of incidents. We are seeing a lot, as I mentioned, of this anti-LGBTQ hate playing out at the school board level all across the US because of conversations like this. There are a lot of conversations on, are teachers allowed to talk about LGBTQ issues, and are they allowed to reference students' LGBTQ identities? So, for example, if a child wants to identify with different pronouns in the classroom, can a teacher do that under their state, local, federal legislation that's present in that school district? And a lot of that stuff is being debated at the school board level. And so I think the places where we see the safest spaces being created for LGBTQ students are places where we have great representation at the school board and local city council level, where folks are either LGBTQ themselves or advocating on behalf of LGBTQ students to make sure that these places are spaces where LGBTQ kids can feel safe going to school.
Yeah. Is California one of the more progressive states when it comes to laws that protect these kids? And what kinds of laws are there right now that you're aware of here?
Yeah, California is definitely one of the places that has some of the best protections for LGBTQ people. And at the same time, that's also why California has become kind of a flashpoint of these different debates over LGBTQ topics. For example, last summer in Glendale, we saw these massive brawls of, 300 plus parents that were arguing outside of an
Yes,
elementary
I
school
remember that.
over. Right, over whether or not
Mhm.
that school should be allowed to designate June Pride Month or whether they should be allowed to display a pride flag in the classroom. And so we see that, even in these progressive places, it's still really important to enact these kinds of protections for LGBTQ students because they are still very much on the chopping block when it comes to what debates are ongoing.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I know that California enacted a law many years ago that mandated them to teach sex education in the schools that would also include LGBTQ education, a fair education on these subjects. And to my knowledge, there are no teeth in that law. So there's nothing actually forcing them to do any of the things that they are supposed to do. Have you seen much of that roll out in California?
So are you asking, have we seen a lot of like protective regulations for LGBTQ
Have
students in
you
California?
seen school districts making sure that that education is provided to the students under
I have
California
I
law?
have seen it in some cases, and there are great protections. I know Governor Newsom has enacted a lot of different LGBTQ protections. There are also a lot of controversial ones that come under that. So there's, for example, Governor Newsom signed into law a protection for transgender inmates that would allow trans women to be located or relocated in some cases to female prisons, which has gathered a lot of attention from anti-trans groups in the US.
Mm.
We've also seen a lot of debates over, there's a particular bill that would allow teachers to use the students' preferred pronouns in the classroom without having to notify their parents that they are asking for a pronoun or a name change. That's generated a lot of controversy amongst parents' rights groups and others. And so, there are different legislations that are being passed at the state level. And in some cases, there are local city councils that are trying to push back against the state and federal legislation to be able to do either pro LGBTQ or anti LGBTQ amendments, depending on how that particular bill goes in the city council debate. It's
Yeah. What is your goal now, this year? What do you want to accomplish?
a good question. I would like to see a reduction in anti-LGBTQ incidents from what we've been tracking. I would also like to see better protections at the federal level for LGBTQ people. I think that with the changes that we've seen coming in the elections of a number of anti-equality candidates, that federal protections, might not be possible in the next year. But I do think that there is enough momentum, as we're talking about at the school board level, at the city council level, that even in states where they might not have state or federal protections, that we could create little pockets of safety for LGBTQ people all throughout both red and blue states across the US.
Yeah. What is the climate now, in the other parts of the country other than California? Is it are kids afraid to come out now? What is the climate like? Is it a scary thing, or is I mean, it seemed to me that it was kind of okay to be out and proud. Is that not the case now?
I think that students who identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual are feeling a bit more protected and more comfortable openly identifying as such. There was an amazing study, I think, earlier this year that found that I think almost 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ. So we know that there are a lot more kids that are openly displaying their true identities. On the other hand, I know that a lot of trans youth in particular are experiencing the impacts of this hate, especially at the federal level. We've seen that in recent weeks. There have been a number of increases in calls to trans hotlines for LGBTQ youth because people are experiencing crisis over what they perceive to be potentially really, really harmful federal legislation coming down the pipeline with the new election. And so
Yeah.
we know that kids are feeling that sense of unsafety. And that's, I think, where it's the responsibility of those of us in positions of power to be able to help them and make sure that they know that they're going to be loved and protected no matter what.
Yeah. There was, I just learned, interestingly enough, I was in a panel with a young man by the name of Derek Black several years ago, whose father was one of the founders of Stormwatch, which is a, a very right-wing neo-Nazi website. I believe that's the name of it. Have you heard of it?
Is
I
it
think you know.
Stormfront, maybe?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that one.
Yep.
Anyway, Derek's family was behind that, and he left them, and actually, when he was in college, met up with some religious Jews who invited him to participate in a Shabbat with them, and he rejected them for a long time, and finally he gave in. And long story short, he ended up um, distancing himself from his family. He was excommunicated, and he ended up becoming part of that sociogram, the Jewish sociogram at his college campus, which is kind of interesting. And I learned recently that he's now come out as trans female. So I guess I shouldn't call him he, they. They have come out as trans, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, to move into one group and then to move into another group. I mean, that's quite an intersection there. How uncommon is that?
I think that, when people feel that they're in spaces where they have community to be able to explore their identities, that's actually not an entirely uncommon phenomena, right? If you feel comfortable to be able to express yourself however you truly identify inside, then, it may be that. I think that that's also why we're seeing like this uptick in people who identify as LGBTQ, right? It goes back to like I'm sure you've seen this on some social media, but the number of people who identify as being left-handed. There was a period in time in schools where being left-handed was, you'd actually get like slapped across the wrist with the ruler and forced to write with your right hand. And so our numbers of left-handed students were extremely low. When that became something that was widely accepted and we started getting accommodations for kids that were left-handed, you saw those numbers rise and then kind of stabilize, right? And so I think that we're experiencing the same phenomenon now where we're telling kids it's okay to come out and be who you are. And so we're seeing this rise right now of young people that are identifying as LGBTQ.
Yeah. Do you track incidents of violence against LGBTQ that comes out of dating apps or meeting
Yes.
strangers online?
Yes, we definitely do. If there is evidence that a person is being attacked or had this violence done to them because of their LGBTQ identity, or that they were, targeted on a dating app because of their LGBTQ identity, then we definitely take that as an incident.
Yeah. Is there any way to keep our kids safe from this?
I think that, sharing stories like you do so well with sharing the story of Blaze, is one of the best ways that we can keep kids safe. There was an unfortunate story that just came out, I want to say a week or so ago, about at Salisbury University in Maryland, where 12 fraternity brothers were just arrested on charges of luring a gay man off of Grindr to an off-campus apartment and then beating him. The person did survive, which is wonderful, but obviously a horrific thing to have happened to him. And so I think it's really highlighting what you're talking about here, that we're still seeing these cases where people are targeting LGBTQ individuals on dating apps. And so we do need to be highlighting the dangers that can come out of this. I think one of the things that we can do from the larger organizational side is partner with apps like Grindr, like Her for Lesbians, like other LGBTQ dating apps in particular, and work with them to build in safety protections for their users on those apps, but also to share these kind of precautionary tales so that people know, hey, if I'm going and meeting up with someone off a dating app, maybe I'm going to tell my friends where I'm supposed to meet them. I'm going to send, maybe screenshots of what their picture looks like to my friends and family. I might bring pepper spray with me. I might bring, other kind of protective measures that they might want to have on hand in case something like that doesn't go as planned. And so, I think sharing these precautionary tales are one of the best ways that we can, unfortunately, try to prevent some of this violence.
Yeah, I know that, and I plan on continuing to advocate for safer internet use by LGBTQ people who are unaware of what happened to Blaze and are unaware that this is really a threat to safety and well-being for people. It's terrifying. It
It
really is. It's something like this could happen. And I mean, Blaze knew this person from high school. So this was not a stranger that did this. This was an acquaintance. So I don't even know how you begin to prevent things like that from happening when it's someone you know. But clearly we need to be doing more as parents to educate our kids. And not all parents even know their kids are LGBTQ in
right.
order to help to protect them and to try to keep them safe. I mean, my son wasn't discussing it with me, really. He told me we don't talk about this. So, you know, I
Right.
I I honored that and kept out of his business. But I really wish that he had been more forthcoming with me and told me, you know, I'm going to be going out with someone tonight. Well, who are you going out with? It would have been, it could have saved his life, you know? So, you know, if you're a parent listening to this and you may not even know that your kid is LGBTQ, and then maybe it doesn't matter because you could have a kid that's heterosexual that could be lured out of your home. The internet is a very dangerous place. I don't know how much you track statistically how much of these incidents occur because of social media and Instagram. I mean, most of the people that are joining extremist groups, do they find extremist groups online?
Yeah, I think that's both the blessing and the curse of these online worlds, right? On the blessing side, it is places where kids can explore their identities. So kids like your son who are, learning about their sexuality and trying to find community with other LGBTQ people, they often do go to the internet to talk with others and to, date and to interact with other people in the community. And that might not be something that they're ready to share publicly or with their family or whatever it might be. And so in those cases, we do need to make sure that we're creating safe spaces for them to have those interactions on the internet, while also protecting them against these very, very real harms that we've seen in the case of Blaze. On the other hand, the internet can be a very, very unsafe place. We know that there are a lot of different radicalizing factors that people, especially young men, can find if they, search hard enough or click on the wrong thing. There's been a lot of studies done on the YouTube autoplay algorithms, for example. So, clicking on something like a pretty moderate right-wing, podcast, if you let that play uninterrupted, in some cases, YouTube will start recommending you slowly, more and more radicalizing content until you end up in these spaces that you maybe had no intention of looking for in the first place. And for young, impressionable minds, that can be a really dangerous situation.
Do these social media outlets and platforms, do they have any liability for these types of things if they're allowing that to happen?
I think that's kind of the big debate at the federal level. So you might hear the word Section 230 thrown around. It was kind of a big debate a couple years ago, not as much now, but it's basically an article that's under the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, that if it was passed, it would hold companies liable for the content that they allow to be spread on their sites. So if we are able to make connections between post on those sites and real world harm against people, the companies in those cases would be liable for it. It's not something
Hmm.
that has been implemented. As you can imagine, the companies really, really lobbied hard against that kind of legislation. And so there aren't currently, in at least in the US, there's better laws in places like Europe, but there aren't currently any kind of liability for social media companies on what their users post on their accounts.
Hmm. And what about holding parents liable that allow this stuff to fester?
Yeah. I don't think that there's any legislation that I've seen that holds parents liable for it. I mean, there are other pieces of legislation, like if you are a parent who is a gun owner and you allow your kid to have access to a gun, like, there are certain liability laws that would access be applicable in those circumstances. But
Hmm.
I know this is why there have been some attempts by companies. Instagram, for example, recently launched their new teen accounts to provide better protections for youth on their platforms. there's a whole host of problems that go into having these kinds of teen specific accounts. But there are attempts being made for parents to be able to put their kids in kind of these like safer internet spaces. But kids are going to be kids, and they're probably going to find their way onto these other platforms, regardless of the protections that we're trying to put in place in these cases.
Yeah, yeah. Before you came to GLAAD, who was doing your job there, and where are they now?
My job didn't exist before I came to GLAAD, so I'm the first person to hold it.
So they weren't studying extremism, or it just wasn't as big of an issue?
It was definitely an issue, but they hadn't kind of broached the extremism space. They were much more focused on media advocacy. So what they would do and what they still do is focus on media perceptions of LGBTQ people. So that does involve countering hateful narratives in a lot of cases. So for example, we've done a lot of work on preventing HIV stigma and helping to showcase positive representation of people living with HIV or AIDS on TV, on the big screen, so on. But in terms of kind of the work that I do in tracking violent extremist groups, that hadn't really been done from the GLAAD side previously.
Yeah. Do you work with the Southern Poverty Law Center at all?
I have worked with
Are
some folks from there before.
Yeah, yeah. Are they still a player? I know that they were several years ago, but I don't know if they're still as actively tracking as they used to.
Yes, they are definitely still actively tracking, and they do still track anti-LGBTQ groups, but they also do a broad range of tracking of different extremist groups as well.
Yeah, yeah. And what are some of the ones that you're following now?
In terms of anti-LGBTQ extremist groups,
Yeah,
there are unfortunately a lot. We actually just put out a great piece with The Advocate that highlights, I think, 27 anti-LGBTQ groups to watch as we approach this election season. So we do highlight in there some that are very powerful on the political and legal advocacy side, and those that are more active on the violent extremist side. Getting at the violent extremist point, some of the groups that we've been looking at include the Goyim Defense League, Blood Tribe, a lot of the different the White Lives Matter network, the Active Club networks, and a lot of these groups have kind of membership that swaps over between the two as well. Some others might be Patriot Front or Proud Boys, or some of like the more regional neo-Nazi groups that are active in different states as well.
mm, that's interesting. Do you have any advice for LGBTQ youth now to stay safe?
Yeah. I think for LGBTQ youth, I mean, you're going to be feeling this pressure from all sides right now. I think just finding those people that you feel comfortable with, feel safe with, that can be your friends, your family, teachers, LGBTQ community leaders, finding those places where you can have the discussions about things like safety, about things like going out and dating, or publicly discussing your identity, or engaging in XYZ forms of activism. Those are going to be the best ways, learning from those who have already kind of lived this life as publicly out figures, and who have experience in the advocacy realm, and what kind of safety precautions might be necessary, I think are some of the best ways that you can stay safe as a youth.
Yeah. And what about you? How do you stay safe? Are you concerned about your own safety?
I do take a lot of precautions to try to minimize any threats to my own safety. I've been very lucky in that regard, that I haven't had any serious concerns in the last couple of years, knock on wood. Um, but there are things that you can do, like for example, when I'm speaking to lovely folks like you and other folks in the media world, just taking basic precautions like not talking about my address, not giving away personally identifiable details, not giving away my phone number or my email on some of these things, being careful what I share publicly, being careful what I share on social media, all of those different kind of somewhat basic digital literacy steps that you can take that make it that much harder for folks to be able to track you down if they really want to.
Yeah. How does GLAAD fund all of the tremendous things that they do?
We're a nonprofit, so all of our funding is through donations. So we, accept donations from $5 all the way up to some of our major donors as well.
Right. And do you have a website where people can learn more?
Yes, you can go to GLAAD.org. If you go to GLAAD.org/alert-desk, that is my particular work focusing on anti-LGBTQ hate and extremism. You can find our reporting form and our donating forms on there as well.
Oh, that's interesting. When you say that your organization is focused on media representations of LGBTQ, does that mean that if something comes across your desk that's defamatory or just mean spirited about LGBTQ people, do you work to have something like that changed? Or, I mean, where is the line for you with freedom of speech as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing is, right, like, I think a lot of people think that we're this super secret scary org that has the power to like go in and delete a Facebook post that we don't like or, delete an Instagram post. I mean, that's just not how it works for any of these big companies. What we do is advocate for the protections and rights of LGBTQ users across a variety of platforms. We have a social media safety team when we see an aggregate of concerning content. So, for example, one of the things that we've been looking into recently have been some tips that we've gotten that the new Instagram teen accounts is actually blocking the word #gay on those accounts. And so we're working to verify the validity of those particular tips. And then if we find out that they are accurate, then we're going to talk to our contacts at Instagram and see if they're open to a conversation about this, if that's something that violates their terms of service, how can we get involved in the case that it doesn't violate their terms of service, how can we get involved in talking to the people that make those terms of service and explain why that could be harmful to LGBTQ users on those teen accounts. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different checks and balances that go into this. And obviously, we very much respect free speech. And we also want to make sure that we are engaging in kind speech and uplifting positive speech on these platforms and creating safe spaces for all users on those platforms as well.
Right, right. Um, I know that we've had issues with being shadow banned on Instagram, and that can happen if you just use certain words in your posts. Is there any way to know if you're being shadow banned for that reason because you've used LGBTQ or #gay or whatever it may be in one of your posts?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no way of really knowing that you have been, unless you get some kind of official notice from the account that says like, hey, this post violated one of our terms of service. That's also a big problem that we're having with a lot of the AI moderation that happens on the social media channels. So when you're not actually having humans review something like this, let's say we take a word like grooming. There have been a lot of people who claim falsely that LGBTQ adults are trying to groom or sexually abuse young children and will make defamatory posts about LGBTQ people in that way. On the other hand, there's a lot of legitimate usage of that word. There's, advertisements for your local dog groomers, or it could be that, there actually is a sexual predator out there that somebody is trying to warn about and talk about grooming tactics. In those cases, it really does require a human moderator to come in and understand the nuances in what would be a defamatory post targeting LGBTQ people on the basis of identity versus something that is, really innocuous or something that's legitimate. And when we have these AI bots that are acting as moderators on a large scale, they don't oftentimes pick up on the nuances of those conversations.
Yeah. Do you track incels or individuals who are threatening?
Yeah, if an incel is attempting to or has, hurt or done some kind of hateful act against an LGBTQ person or somebody who's supportive of the community, then that would definitely be something that we would track as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Are incels a big problem?
Incels in my space aren't as much of the concern because they don't tend to have kind of the group organization. You're not going to see a group of incels marching down the street in the same way that you might with Blood Tribe or the Going Defense League or some of the other local neo-Nazi groups. They tend to be much more active just on their own little chat forums where they're sharing their own hateful comments on
Yeah.
there. So in that sense, we don't tend to see them doing as much of the offline violence, but there are cases like, for example, the tragic mass murder committed by Elliot Rodger, who's kind of one of the most famous incels. Um, that, are one of these examples where incels can cross over from the online world into offline violence.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I think I've come to believe, and it's somewhat anecdotal, that these hate groups draw from the pool of incels, that they are the most likely people, probably, if they're not born into it, to actively search for a group of people that hate. Um, I don't know if that's necessarily true, just it seems to be something that I've kind of concluded from my own research. But
Sure. I think, the incel community is very attractive, especially to young men who maybe are feeling very isolated, feeling like they're not able to connect with others their own age. That is a very attractive community to them for those reasons. Um, there are a lot of people that join movements like other neo-Nazi groups or other violent extremist groups who are married, who, have a lot of interactions with women who would not consider themselves to be part of the incel community. So there is like, very different ideologies within these gross corners of the internet. But at the same time, there is crossover between the two. So it might be that you see somebody who started out on incel forums and somebody on there started posting a lot of Nazi content. They saw that content, got interested, messaged that person. Turns out they're also a member of a local neo-Nazi chapter. They join that chapter's group on Telegram, and then, from there start getting involved in the world of neo-Nazism in the US. So there is differences in ideology between these different actors on the internet, but there also is a lot of crossover between people who are finding these murkier corners of the internet.
yeah. One last thing I'd like to talk to you about more is this intersectionality. I know that you've given me the statistics before. And basically, out of what was it, over 200 incidents since 2022, 20% of them were against Jewish and LGBTQ individuals. Of those LGBTQ incidents, 20% of them were Jewish people also.
Yes. So since June 1st of 2022, about 18% of all of the anti-LGBTQ incidents that we tracked, which was over 2,050, were also including either the targeting of Jewish persons or also included anti-Semitic tropes as well.
Mhm. So you're particularly vulnerable in some of these intersections. Like you were saying, also, like if you're trans and you're African American, you are at greater risk. I don't know what the statistics are with that, but is it mostly trans incidents are involved African Americans?
When we see cases of fatal violence against transgender or gender nonconforming people, there is a disproportionate amount of people that is targeted by that kind of violence who are either Black or otherwise a person of color.
Hmm.
The Human Rights Campaign has a really great page that details all of those statistics and the names of those that they are tracking who have been victims of this kind of violence. So we know that there is this kind of disproportionate targeting of Black trans women in the US in particular.
Yeah. Do hate groups, are they particularly interested in going after LGBTQ, or are they more interested like an Atomwaffen or I don't know, some other neo-Nazi group, the Goyim Defense League or whatever they call themselves? Um, are they more likely to go after Jewish people or LGBTQ people? Who is more in danger in that intersection?
I think it really, unfortunately, depends on the day. It depends on the area. It depends on the person, right? Um, when we're talking about the context in the US after 10/7 from last October, there was a large targeting of Jewish people in the US, especially by these neo-Nazi groups. And so it might be that after that particular flashpoint, that there was more of a focus on hate targeting Jewish people. Right before that, though, we saw was Pride Month, and that was actually one of the cases where we saw this soaring rise in anti-LGBTQ incidents. And so it might be that the prevalence of Pride Month and seeing pride flags hanging up and down the street and seeing people openly express their LGBTQ identity could also be a flashpoint for extremists in that case, which we saw play out in the number of incidents that we tracked. So it really kind of depends on the context, the day, the group, the whims of that person that they, decide that they want to go after. But in a lot of cases, these people are kind of equal opportunity offenders.
Hmm. Yeah, but if you heard that a Jewish LGBTQ person had been murdered or injured by one of these groups, would your first thought be that it was because they were Jewish?
I think it would depend on what had happened. So let's say they were
Yeah,
murdered at a synagogue, right? Or like outside of a JCC or something like that. I would
yeah,
assume in that case that they were probably targeted for being Jewish, or if they were wearing,
right.
let's say, the yarmulke, if they were wearing the Star of David, something like that. That might be more of an indication. On the other hand, maybe they were attacked at an LGBTQ bar or at a Pride event or something like that. In that case, I might assume that they were attacked for being LGBTQ. There's, a lot of different kind of contextual questions that I would ask before making any of those kinds of determination. And we would also rely really heavily on witness and police statements to determine, what was kind of the motivation in that particular assault.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a double whammy when they can find somebody that's both, I suppose. They get more cred for
Under the
sure.
neo-Nazi ideology, it would be, kind of a double whammy, as you're saying, in that
Hmm.
you consider it a win to be taking down people who are both Jewish and LGBTQ.
Yeah. And on that note, I want to thank GLAAD for helping Pep Talks with Jeannie to go forward and to link into the broader network of news and media because we are collaborating, which is really lovely. And I do appreciate all the help that GLAAD has given me. Um, you're a tremendous organization with amazing, incredible resources and incredible people that get the work done there, and very dedicated people. So, to you, thank you, and thank you, Sarah, for being part of Pep Talks. I greatly appreciate it, and I appreciate your appearance on the 48 Hour special that we were also featured on. Um, I imagine I'll be seeing more of you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Um,
It's so great to speak with you and to speak with your community today.
Yes, and yeah, I do. I really do appreciate everything that you have done to help my family and to advance the rights and the interests of people in the LGBTQ community.
And
And
you're doing such amazing work as well. Like it's so amazing to see people who are family members of LGBTQ people who are such amazing allies to LGBTQ people, uplifting our stories and giving us a place to talk about this kind of hate and what we can do to overcome it.
yeah, well, I just constantly have to remind the public that regardless of how you feel about LGBTQ people right now, tomorrow you could have a grandchild that comes out. So think about that the next time you decide to discriminate against somebody who is part of this community, because we are all part of this community one way or another. And the sooner you realize that, the safer you can keep your children and your grandchildren. Hashtag Blaze It Forward is a campaign my family started in 2018 after our son Blaze was murdered. Hashtag Blaze It Forward provides the inspiration to thousands of people to repair the world with intentional acts of kindness. If you would like to learn more about Blaze and how you can make a difference, check out www.blazebernstein.org or join our Facebook group at hashtag Blaze It Forward. You can also check out my website for this podcast at www.peptalkswithjeannie.com. There you can follow along with my podcasting adventures and learn more about my fascinating guests and their passion projects. I would like to thank all of the volunteers who help make my philanthropic endeavors a reality. Today, that includes my producer, Eli Moskowitz, all of the volunteer crew members who join us, and a special thank you to my son, Jay Bernstein, for the original theme song you hear at the beginning and ending of each show. This has been another episode of Pep Talks with Jeannie. Until next time, keep on making this world a better place.